Record. Okay. So yes, welcome. My name is Claire. I am a volunteer with 19 to 0. 19 to 0 is a group of healthcare professionals and community members that are working to share information about COVID-19 vaccines. And the 19 to 0 group is based out of the University of Calgary, but we're national in scope. And if you're interested in learning more about 19 to 0, you can check out our website at 19to0.ca. So before starting our event, I kind of want to give a little bit of a brief introduction about how the evening is going to be structured. So our presentation will begin with a more general overview of vaccines, and then we will go into a discussion about COVID-19 vaccination in children and in teens. And these sections will be presented by Dr. Cora Constantinescu. She's a pediatric infectious disease physician and a true vaccine expert in this area, so we're so lucky to have her. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go through some topics related to vaccination in adults. We will discuss things like vaccines in pregnant individuals, vaccine mixing, long-term effects, etc. And that section is going to be presented by Dr. David Sun, who's a family physician who we're lucky to have here as well. So I want to kind of just give a little bit of a reminder here today that the goal of this presentation is to provide information so that you can make your choice about vaccination. So we're here to provide information ultimately today. I received some questions via email leading up to the event today, and those will be answered during our Q&A section after the presentation. So throughout the talk, feel free to leave your questions in that Q&A function. So after hearing about I'll go to the next slide really quick. So after hearing our presentation today, we are asking you to consider giving us some feedback through this survey, which I'm going to send in the chat right now. And it's also available via that QR code on the screen. So that would be so great if you could just kind of keep this link handy and provide us some feedback at the end of the presentation. So today, many of our presenters and guests are coming and joining us from Calgary. So I'm going to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So today we were supposed to have Councillor George Chahal join us. He's from Ward 5 in Calgary, and he was going to give a couple remarks. I'm not sure if he was able to make it online at this time. All right, so we'll try to see if he joins us a little bit later, and we'll kind of come back to him at that point. But for now, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Cora.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful, incredibly warm and sunny day. I'll tell you a little bit about me. I'm a pediatrician and infectious disease specialist. I work at the Alberta Children's Hospital, and there I do infectious diseases in children. And I work about half my time in a clinical, like in a hospital and clinic setting. And as part of the hospital, we also run a vaccine hesitancy clinic. And as part of my academic and education time, I do have a medical educator appointment, and my kind of specialization niche is around vaccine hesitancy, vaccine uptake, and specifically supporting parents as they make the vaccination decision. So I'll start with this, and I say that it's normal to have concerns about this vaccine, and I'm a parent too, and I get it. It's hard to think of any vaccines that have been developed in less than a year is something you want to give your kids. And this idea that the vaccine was rushed has been something that we've been kind of battling with for the last year in terms of trying to explain to people how the vaccine process works and the development process works. And I also understand that with children, we have been so spared in terms of the severity of this disease. And I'm so grateful, again, as a pediatrician, as a mom, that our children have not had nearly the same rate of death and severity as adults have had with this disease. So it's natural to think, well, what are the benefits of the vaccine to my child? What are the risks of the vaccine? So we're here because we want to answer some of those questions and try to put it into perspective the way we see it. Next slide, please.
Yes, just before we go to the next slide, Dr. Cora, Counselor George Tahal has joined us. So we're just going to give him the floor for a minute here before we continue with the presentation. So take it away.
No problem, and welcome.
Hello, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. I've had the opportunity to host a town hall with Dr. C. Constantinescu a number of months back, and so informative. I learned so much from her, and I know so many who watched that town hall decided to get vaccinated. So I'm excited to be here today just to share a little bit of information on the importance of the conversation we're having today. These are really important concerns that I hear every day from my constituents, our residents, on getting vaccinated and how it's impacting their families and kids. There is a lot of concerns, but they want to hear from the experts. They want to hear from the doctors who do this every day and who have a strong understanding of the importance of getting vaccinated. I know that previously the great work that Dr. C's done, as well as Dr. Sun, is getting this information out and providing this forum, and this information has been extremely beneficial. I know there's so many questions that need to be addressed, and this will be very helpful to everybody. We've seen over the last year, this pandemic's had a tremendous toll on all of us, on our communities, our families, and kids. And with my own 3 daughters, I've seen the starts and stops with schools opening and closing. I can tell you, we all want to get back to normal, and our kids want to get back to normal. We need to get back to normal, but we also need to get vaccinated and ensure that the vaccines are safe for our kids that we all have concerns about, and that the proper medical information is being shared and offered by our medical experts. That's the information we need to see. That's the information we need to listen to. Thank you so much, Dr. C and Dr. Sun, for the great work you're doing in sharing and providing, and your dedication and commitment to educating the public. Thank you for having me on for a few minutes, and I look forward to listening and learning more throughout the conversation. Please get vaccinated.
Thank you for those kind words.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. So I really like this slide because it shows a few things. So it shows the individuals under 19 years of age who've in Canada, and what we have seen, especially with this 3rd wave, is that there's been a shift in the demographics, in the epidemiology of this disease, and we have seen that younger people, especially the unvaccinated people, as we're seeing towards the tail end of this 3rd wave, have made up more of the number of cases than ever before, more so than the 2nd and the 1st wave. And you know, before there was this a bit of magical thinking that somehow children don't spread it, children don't tend to pass it on to each other, they don't tend to have the disease, but actually it, you know, we've since learned that children do get the disease, and when you test appropriately and when you look for the disease in that age group, you do find it. And then the interestingly, most recently, and again we're seeing this as a shift in the epidemiology, the age group with the highest 7-day rolling average of cases was school-aged children, aged 5 to 19 in our own province. Next slide, please. I have to tell you, I might get invaded by 1 or 2 or 3 of my children at any point. So this is my all-time favorite slide. And the reason I like this slide is because even as I tell you that more than 32 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine have been administered in Canada, were already out of date. More have been administered since we built the slide just yesterday. So over 32 million doses in Canada. In Alberta, we have over 3 million. We have 75.8% of Canadians having had at least one dose, and almost 25% fully vaccinated. We're at 22.3% fully vaccinated. And I hope everybody, I'm going to stop here for a second and say thank you to all the people who've come forward and have answered this call to action to get vaccinated. And also thank you to all of you who've been vaccine champions over these last few months and have helped and supported your neighbors and your family and friends to get vaccinated, because we're doing incredibly well. We started off with a difficult, rocky vaccine rollout start, but we can feel really proud of all the effort and all the work that our governments, our health agencies, and our individual people have put into getting us to the 75% on that first dose. And I hope that we continue so we get to this particular percentage and even higher with the second dose as well. Next slide, please. Many of you, especially as we think of children and as we've hit this 75% mark on the first dose, are saying, well, are we at herd immunity yet? Where is herd immunity right now? And it's a bit of a difficult answer to give in terms of an exact number. And that's because herd immunity depends on a number of factors. The biggest one being transmissibility of the virus. And transmissibility of the virus is dependent on the virus itself. So when we talk about variants, for example, such as the Delta variant, we're seeing higher transmissibility of it. So any new variant can throw this whole herd immunity idea back into a kind of a guessing game because of the fact that the transmissibility can change. But also, unlike before, we're now talking about opening things up. So in 2 weeks from now, transmissibility is going to be very different if people get together in close proximity in indoor spaces without masks and without the physical distancing before than we would have had transmissibility in the era of public health restrictions. So this is important for people to understand that when we discuss transmissibility of this virus before, most of the studies were based on transmissibility around health with health restrictions. What we do have, however, that works in our favor now is that we have vaccinated people, and we know that transmissibility of the virus is significantly reduced in vaccinated people as well. But what exactly that transmissibility is and how it's going to play into that herd immunity is still a little bit up in the air. And then the other aspect of herd immunity that's important is that we need to know, it also depends on vaccine rollout. So can people get that second dose, which we know is important in terms of personal protection, but also how long the protection lasts. And that's key. And now we're seeing some of the data emerging, 6 months. Now some of it is up to 9 months. Soon enough, we're going to get to the 12-month period since the first studies commenced. So the initial Pfizer and Moderna studies started in July of last year. So we're getting there in terms of the 12-month follow-up. And those people who are in the initial studies are still being followed in terms of seeing how long the immunity lasts. But again, all these factors play into herd immunity. You've heard a lot of people say we need 75, around 80%. I also, and I'm hopeful that this indeed is still the number. But again, I want to remind people that we're talking about 2 doses, not just 1 dose that has a different protection, especially against variants. Next slide, please. Even though this has been, probably you've heard this a lot, I want to bring this up again, especially as we talk about children and the vaccine development and regulatory approval. And the reason I want to bring it up is because often people say, well, this was so rushed. And it's true in a lot of ways that this vaccine was faster and more efficiently produced than any other vaccine before. We're talking, 4 years was the previous record, and this is in less than a year. And they were able to do that largely because they already had a platform that they were already working on. So companies like Moderna Moderna had already developed their mRNA vaccine around some infectious disease vaccines and also around cancer vaccines. So the platform was there. So once they were able to sequence the virus, they were able to just kind of take this new CD and play it into the CD player, and the CD player being the platform they had already developed. There were also huge numbers of COVID in the population, so they were able to reach the endpoints quickly, especially in the places where they did them. They did studies in Brazil, the UK, the US. And then also all that red tape and funding issues, and you know, as a researcher, a lot of the stuff that holds back the research is you know, getting the funding, setting things up, reaching that endpoint that you want. All those things were not there during the pandemic. All that red tape was dealt with because of the health crisis that was upon the world, and I would say still is in many places. What I want you to know is that when it comes to safety, these studies were huge. So typically to get a vaccine to licensure, you need about 6,000 to 8,000 participants in those in the clinical phase 3 trials. For these studies, they were anywhere between 22 to 46,000, so much larger than before. So there was no compromise on safety. There wasn't really any compromise on efficacy either, except that they could not do long-term protection checks, and this is still ongoing. So those people are still being monitored and they're still being studied. But by the time this was actually authorized, we only had a few months of known protection. The place where these rapid vaccine development lost was in the populations. So the initial populations did not include pregnant women and didn't include children, didn't include immunocompromised people, because so the safety and efficacy was well maintained, but the diversity of the populations were reduced, which is why we're now seeing new studies that had to be developed for those specific populations, but also why it is so much slower to roll out that vaccine to those populations. And Dr. Sun will talk to you about pregnancy and this vaccine, because that's another really crucial population that was not included in the initial trials. Next slide, please. The only vaccine right now authorized in children in Canada is the Pfizer vaccine. The Moderna has also applied for authorization. Both of these are mRNA vaccines. So we're going to focus our talk mostly around mRNA vaccines. But the way mRNA vaccines work is that they have a spike protein. So the spike protein is that important protein on the virus that our immune system recognizes and builds immunity to. But they're quite smart, because instead of having the whole virus and having other parts of the machinery of the virus, they just have that spike protein. The spike protein gets injected into our own cells. Sorry, the mRNA gets injected into our own cells. The mRNA then goes into our own ribosomes, and our own cells make the spike protein. So it's kind of like a recipe that the vaccine contains. And then our immune system sees the spike protein, builds antibodies against it, and then our body degrades both the spike protein as well as the mRNA pretty quickly in the body. Next slide, please. I've told the story a few times, and I apologize if you've heard it, but I tell you, when they first announced the efficacy of the mRNA vaccine, and I remember exactly where I was, and I remember listening to radio and hearing that they were 94% effective, I felt incredibly overwhelmed and cried, because I did not think that these vaccines were going to be as good as they were. And I think we're so lucky and blessed that they were, but they're incredibly efficacious vaccines. We're talking 90 to 94% protection. And what's really cool is that Alberta Health has all this kind of data, such as effectiveness, available on their website. So if you go on Alberta Health stats around the COVID-19 vaccine, you're not going to see just the efficacy, which is what is seen in clinical trials. You're going to see actually how good the vaccine is in the real world. And right now, as of, I want to say last week, the Pfizer vaccine was at 90%, Moderna was at 93%. So incredibly effective vaccines in the real world as well. Next slide, please. Oh, I forgot, we have the slide. So here it is. So yeah, this is where we're at as of yesterday, June the 21st, 2021. And this is all publicly available data. This is what I have to say that Alberta has done so well in making this data available to everybody. You can look this up. You can see how many people who are immunized are in hospitals, the percentages and the percentages of the people who are unimmunized being in hospitals. And you can see the vaccine work in real time in our own province. I know, go back one slide. I just want to mention the Delta variant. Sorry, I knew that slide was coming up, Claire. Claire's trying to anticipate my next part. So the one thing I want to bring your attention to is that there's been a lot of talk about Alpha and the Gamma variants. The Alpha variant, or the variant first described in the UK, is the most commonly encountered variant in our province. And what I want you to look at is that the effectiveness is still impressive. So you have 73% effectiveness after one dose of this vaccine. But this is why that second dose is really important, because it goes up to 91%. However, what I also want you to know is that when it comes to severe disease and death, so severity and death, the one dose is still incredibly effective, more than 73%. It's more into the 90%. So having one dose is so much better than having no doses at all in terms of protection against the more ancestral strain, but also against the variants. Having two doses makes a huge difference to that personal protection. Next slide, please. And to illustrate that, only 0.3% of people with one dose were diagnosed with COVID-19, 0.0005% of people with two doses were diagnosed with COVID-19 vaccine, again, in our own province. Next slide, please. So you know that as of May of 2021, Health Canada approved the use of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines in kids 12 years of age and older. And this authorization was based on a few things. First was the fact that over 2 million adolescents in the US who were 16 and 17-year-olds at that point had already had this vaccine, and a phase 3 trial that Pfizer did for the 12 to 15-year-old children that included about 22 to 2,300 adolescents that looked at the efficacy of the vaccine. And what's really, really exciting about this age group is that they showed an incredibly brisk and robust immune response. And we know that because with other vaccines, such as the HPV vaccine, though the HPV vaccine is the human papillomavirus vaccine, again, if you give it to this age group, there's something magical in that immune system. The immune system does something really good. It actually produces 12 to 15 times more antibodies than if you were to give it to older people. And by older, I mean like people in their 20s, not, we're not talking about people in the 70s or 80s. So there's something about that immune system that has this really robust response. And so much so that in that Pfizer trial, and again, in the Moderna trial, after 2 doses, there wasn't any COVID-19 infection in the vaccinated group, giving it 100% efficacy in that age group. Now, obviously, this is what happens in a clinical trial. I do not expect that this vaccine is going to be 100% efficacious in the real world, but it's probably going to be very, very close, because we know that for the adults, that was very close as well. Next slide, please. So a lot of people ask me this. They say, well, why should we vaccinate our kids? Because as I mentioned before, thankfully, we haven't been so affected by this in terms of the same severity. And here's what I say. The first thing is you want them to have personal protection. It's true that COVID-19 has not been nearly as bad in children as in adults, but it's not a benign disease. We actually have, in the US and also in Canada, 2 times the hospitalizations compared to the flu. We have way more death compared to the flu, and it's still in the top 10 causes of death. COVID-19 is in the top 10 causes of death for this age group, for the teenager age group. So it's important that this is not a benign disease. Even children with very mild disease, about 1 to 2 in 1,000, which is a significant number, can develop multisystem inflammation. And multisystem inflammation happens often in children who've had very mild disease. They may have only had a sore throat or maybe a runny nose. They were not badly symptomatic to begin with. And then a few weeks later, there's something that happens with that immune response whereby you can have inflammation throughout the system, but most concerningly to the heart, to the circulatory system. And we have seen a number of messy cases in our hospitals, the same with the Stollery hospital, they've seen that. And I would say it's probably our most commonly cause for consultation on the COVID-19 kids. It's not so much the disease itself in the beginning, even though that can also be bad in some cases. It's this post-infectious inflammation that can happen. Then we also want to prevent virus transmission. So we know that children can transmit, and they have been sometimes vectors whereby they bring the disease into the household. And that's particularly important if you have certain adults who've been vaccinated, but their immune system is not as robust. So if you have adults who've had a solid organ transplant, a cancer, whether it's a blood or a solid organ, a solid cancer, then those people are not going to respond as well, even to 2 doses of the vaccine, as somebody whose immune system otherwise would be intact. So we know that children can still bring the disease and transmit it to others who may be more vulnerable despite their vaccination status. At the end of the day, we also want to protect the broader community, and kids make up over 20% of our population. And then if you ask children why they want to be immunized, they want to go back to normal. They just want to go back to having a normal life. They want to go to school in person. They want to be able to play sports. They want to play with their friends. And I'll tell you something anecdotally that I'm going to shock Claire because this is nowhere near on the slides, but I'm just going to tell you and why I love kids, and I'm so grateful to be a pediatrician. You know, when we ask adults why they get vaccinated, they'll say, well, it's about personal protection and I want to come back to normal. Those are the big things as to why adults get vaccinated. They don't talk so much about protecting the world around them, protecting the community around them. But with teenagers, anecdotally, what I've gotten when I ask them is they all want to go back to normal, but they also want to do their part to protect the community and to protect their families and to protect and to do their part to stop the pandemic. And it's, to me, so touching that teenagers, there's so much to learn from them, because we sometimes get bogged down in our own needs and wants and so on. And often we talk about teenagers as being self-centered, but it's interesting to me how they have so much wisdom and ability to think outside of themselves about the greater world. Sorry, I'll stop here, but I just want to tell you this because every time I think about this, I'm just blown away of the wisdom of kids. Next slide, please. I'll go back to the presentation now. Okay, so I told you they have this really robust immune response. They also have a really brisk immune response in terms of side effects. So 9 out of 10 kids complained of a sore arm. In adults, that's about 7 to 8, so more so in children. 7 out of 10 had headache or fatigue. In adults, about 5 to 10 had chills. It's about similar to adults. 1 in 4 had fever. Adults are somewhere between 1 and 3. So a few more short-term effects happened in children and their robust immune systems. Most of these, however, are pretty mild. They were treated with Advil or Tylenol, and the companies, both Moderna and Pfizer, have said it's fine to try to use an antipyretic or something against fever and pain after the vaccine. Next slide, please. What I do want to spend a couple of minutes on, or maybe a bit more, is what you've probably heard about, is this myocarditis post the second dose of the vaccine. And this is an important thing that's now being significantly studied. And I'll tell you how this kind of came to be. So there were some reports of myocarditis and pericarditis, which means there's inflammation of the heart muscle and the sac around the heart following mRNA vaccination, and specifically seem to be in younger people. So those 30 years of age and younger, and they seem to be a bit of a male gender predisposition. Now, cases have been most commonly observed a few days up to 4 days after the second dose, and a rate of about 16 cases per million second doses. And there is that younger and male predisposition, and the recovery, however, is incredibly favorable. But this doesn't mean that we should not study this well. And I'll tell you a bit about myocarditis. Myocarditis, which means inflammation of the heart, in younger people is mostly from a viral infection. So that's kind of our top reason for it. What's interesting is that myocarditis itself has been described with COVID, including in younger people. They can get myocarditis, they can get inflammation of the heart. So about 75%, there was a study that looked at 75% of people who had mild COVID, 75% of them had heart scarring. So some kind of inflammation. So there is what I call a biological plausibility, which means that it could be that if you get it from the actual disease, you could get it from the vaccine as well. So this is why this is not taken lightly. And people like to err on the side of caution and say, we would rather investigate this fully. And I think there is probably a link between this myocarditis and the vaccine. It is being looked at very carefully. And as a matter of fact, this week, and I think it's tomorrow, there's a big meeting about this to see if there are certain risk factors that can be identified to help guide on that timing of that second dose for children, and to see indeed if there are more things that are being discovered about it. The complicated part about myocarditis is that what the baseline rate of myocarditis is in different age groups is not so easily known at baseline. So then it's hard to say, is this that much more with vaccine or not? But there is a biological plausibility here, which is why this is being so carefully investigated. Next slide, please. Claire, are you able to get to the next slide? Oh yeah, here's my next slide, sorry. I also then want to dive in a bit deeper into this case series of 7 children. So this was published in a journal where they looked at 7 children, all male, who had received the vaccine and then developed myocarditis. Again, the cases happened 2 to 4 days after the vaccination. They were all hospitalized, but not for a long period of time. So somewhere in the 3 to 5 day period. All 7 had recovered, and so whereas this is quite a serious effect, it does seem to be rare and treatable. But again, we need more information to see if this is linked to this kind of event. And it is important to remember that when we vaccinate millions of people, this is why having a vaccine surveillance program is so crucial, because this is how you can get to those really rare side effects that otherwise you would not see in a clinical study. Even if one had, 5,000, 10,000 people, sometimes you don't get to that really rare side effect. Next slide, please. Just going to take a second to tell you what's kind of next for vaccines in children. More than 3,700 adolescents, the Moderna trial. So this has been already sent in for authorization. Again, very high efficacy. It has been submitted to Health Canada, but as yet we do not have this vaccine authorized for children. Next slide, and I think this is it for me, and thank you.
Yeah, so now we'll pass it off to Dr. David Sun.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is David Sun. I'm a family doctor. I'm based here in Edmonton. I have my own private practice. I'm here as a physician, but I'm also here as a parent. I have 4 kids myself. My oldest is 12 years old. He's received his first dose of the Pfizer, and he's going to be receiving his second dose this week, actually. And he was actually very excited to get the vaccine. He was bothering me about when he could receive it, even though I had not really talked to him about receiving himself. So I'm proud of him for that. So our clinic, we're also administering the vaccine. We administer Moderna primarily. And we also just recently received Pfizer and will be starting the administration for youth 12 to 17. So moving from children to adults, during the pandemic, certainly pregnant women are feeling very, very vulnerable, not just because of the risk of infection, but also just the confusion around the vaccines. So many of my patients, because I take care of many prenatal patients, have voiced the concern that they might feel they're being experimented on. And we can, at this point, reassure that in general, you don't need to be feeling like you're being experimented on, because many women before you have already received the vaccine. In the States, they've collected data for 100,000 women, and there's been no signs that anything dangerous is happening with the 100,000 pregnant women who've received the vaccine. Of course, you haven't collected data for all those people, but even for a study that was out earlier in the spring, about 35,000 pregnant women and women who are planning to conceive, there was no information from the surveys that there was any red flags or any unknown risks. So it seems like after all of this information, we can be more and more secure about the safety of the vaccine for pregnancy. The SOGC, the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Canada, they strongly recommend the vaccine for all pregnant and breastfeeding women. We have to always keep in mind that although it's hard for us to prove that anything is completely risk-free, we're never comparing the risk of the vaccine versus zero. It's the risk of the vaccine versus the risk of not receiving the vaccine. So pregnant women, if you were to catch COVID-19, you would be at very high risk for severe disease, hospitalization, ICU admission, even death. And that is 22 times more likely compared to pregnant women without COVID-19, okay? So again, the vaccine so far has been quite safe. There is no evidence that it would affect fertility. Some women have been worried that through certain mechanisms related to proteins in the placenta, this might be the case, but because there hasn't been any cases of increased miscarriage, so far there is no evidence that we should be worried about fertility, okay? If some people are particularly worried, it is all right to receive the vaccine after the first 12 weeks, because certainly the first 12 weeks you're feeling the most vulnerable. That's when miscarriages happen the most frequently. We would say it's safe to receive the vaccine during that point, but if you're not in a high risk category that would be exposed, and if you wanted to wait until after the 12-week, that should be okay as well. We would remind you to receive the vaccine, the second dose, a couple weeks before your due date, so that you would have the full effect of the vaccine once you're hospitalized. Okay. And in terms of breastfeeding, sorry, I just wanted to mention that there doesn't seem like there's any risk to the child. In fact, we feel that it should be helpful because the antibodies can pass through breast milk, and the antibodies probably also pass through the placenta. So there's probably some passive immunity for the newborn child. And after birth, they're still getting some antibodies pass through the breast milk that can coat their mucosa. How effective that passive immunity is for preventing infection, we don't know. But so far, it doesn't seem like there would be risk, and there would be only potential benefit. Okay, next slide, thanks. So in terms of the vaccination guidelines, I can share that it's very confusing because the recommendations keep changing. I don't know if anyone here has received the AstraZeneca vaccine, but right now we are recommending that you mix and match the vaccine. So after the first dose of AstraZeneca, if it's been at least 8 weeks of the first dose, please get a second dose, and recommended to get the mRNA vaccine, because the mRNA vaccines produce a more robust response. And it seems that the mixing and matching produces an even better reaction than 2 doses of the same vaccine. So this is not just based on the fact that we have more vaccine stock and we just want people to get vaccinated as soon as possible, there is evidence from the UK and from Spain that mixing and maxing vaccines is safe. They don't produce any greater number of adverse events. The usual vaccine side effects can be more pronounced, however. So if you do get a second dose of Moderna or Pfizer following AstraZeneca, the side effects such as fever, sore arms, things like that could be a little bit more prominent than 2 doses of AstraZeneca vaccine, but otherwise there is no danger, okay? At the same time though, if you've already received 2 doses of AstraZeneca, it doesn't seem like you've had a bad vaccine because the AstraZeneca vaccine still works very well. We've had the efficacy numbers reported earlier for the mRNA vaccine, but even for AstraZeneca vaccine, even now we're experiencing the Delta variants around the world, and that's probably going to take over here in Canada. The AstraZeneca vaccine with 2 doses, according to the UK data, it will protect you 64% of the time against symptomatic disease, 92% against hospitalization, and 100% protection against death, okay? And just to emphasize the importance of the second dose, if you only have 1 dose of the vaccine, some data from the UK saying that it's very weak, maybe just 33%, but with the 2 doses, it goes up to being as effective as it was against the other original strains. So that's just one more reason to make sure you get the second dose. Okay, please go on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, I talked mostly about the information here, but another reason for not using as much AstraZeneca is that we can reduce the risk of blood clots. For the first dose of AstraZeneca, the blood clot risk was about 1 in 100 to 200,000. Now, if you didn't have the immune reaction causing that blood clot for the first dose, the risk of having the blood clot for the second dose is extremely low. It's only 1 in 600,000, okay? But then there is no risk of having the blood clots with Moderna or Pfizer. So it's one more reason why we're recommending mixing with the mRNA vaccines, okay? So with the mRNA vaccines, we're also recommending people to get the second dose as conveniently and as readily as possible. If sometimes, for example, right now the Pfizer is being delayed across the provinces, you might be receiving a Moderna as a second dose, even if you had a Pfizer. That is perfectly okay because these 2 vaccines work based on the same mechanisms and should produce an equal, if not even potentially better response. Dr. Hinshaw actually just tweeted yesterday that mixing and matching can possibly be even better between the mRNA vaccines. I personally had Pfizer first and I had Moderna second. I chose to do so. Okay, next slide, please. The virus can still spread after vaccination. Let's keep in mind that no vaccine is perfect. There's going to be some breakthrough infection, and some people who get infected can still pass on the virus. So we've talked about the importance of getting both doses. Okay, 1 dose is very effective, but 2 dose is even more important. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the COVID vaccines are not indicated currently for anyone with severe allergic reaction or anaphylaxis to a component of the vaccine. This is extremely rare. If you've had medications that include the ingredient polyethylene glycol and you've been allergic to that, then you wouldn't be recommended to have the vaccine. But that is extremely rare and probably less than 1 in a million. Initially, there were many reports that the risk was around 1 in 100,000, but it seems like it's much lower now, okay? If you do have a history of allergies and you're really worried, you can choose to wait for 30 minutes outside the pharmacy or the AHS vaccination site. The other contraindications would be if you've had another vaccine within the past 14 days. This is just to make sure that all the vaccines can work properly, give them enough time for the immune system to mature. So if you receive the shingles vaccine, HPV vaccine, etc., wait 2 weeks and then receive the COVID vaccine. And right now, of course, we don't have enough information for younger than 12, so they're not recommended. Next slide. Oh, sorry, we've talked about the allergies. So if you are worried about the other ingredients, please go on the Government of Canada website. The entire list of ingredients is listed. If you have any questions, whether or not it's suitable for you to receive the vaccine, please come talk to one of us, a family doctor, or talk to your child's pediatrician. Next slide. Right now, the side effects are expected to occur within 6 weeks. Okay, so for example, at the time AstraZeneca was in a lot of controversy, some of the blood clots could have happened a couple of weeks after initial administration. We don't have any evidence that there are more long-term effects. But at the same time, we know that the long-term effects of COVID can be extremely severe. Long COVID, post-COVID syndrome is extremely common with my patients. Many of them have become quite debilitated and can no longer work. Post-COVID is also a reality for children. And as the virus mutates and evolves, the more infectious, virulent strains can potentially increase this as well. So again, although we may not be able to see through a crystal ball and tell you 100% that there are no other long-term effects, it so far outweighs the potential risk of long COVID in our patients. Okay, next slide, please. So the vaccine can be effective for at least 6 months. We can only give as much information as we have. So as the information keeps rolling out, we have not really seen any signs saying that people are losing their immunity. It seems that immunity is lasting for a long time, but again, we will be updating the information as we go. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so I think we're gonna end there and start taking questions if that's all right. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides so that we can have kind of a discussion here. All right, so one of the first questions that we have, and one of the questions that was coming up even before the presentation over email, was just related to some of the World Health Organization's thoughts about vaccination in kids versus what age groups are eligible in Canada. And if you guys could address that question for us.
Yeah, so you've probably seen this happen. I think there were two kind of announcements about this a day ago and about 3 days ago, that the WHO said they do not think we should vaccinate kids. And everybody took this and ran with it as if it's a safety issue, but it's not. And I want people to understand that it doesn't have anything to do with safety and everything to do with vaccine equity. So the WHO has to look after the entire world. And this is where the ethical and moral dilemma of this vaccine comes into play. And in Canada, we are so blessed and lucky with the abundance of vaccine we have. So much so that we can vaccinate to go back to normal so people can travel, whereby you can see that some people in the rest of the world, like in India, people are not worried about travel, about going back to normal, about businesses losing their income. They're worried about people dying because they cannot stop this wave and their variants. And it's so difficult for them to actually get death under control and hospitalizations, and they're running out of things like oxygen. So the WHO has to look after the equity of the global distribution of the vaccine. So this is why the WHO looks at places like Canada and the US saying, well, you could vaccinate your children, or we could look at vaccinating the entire global market. But I tell you, issues with inequity around this vaccine have been many, and they're ongoing. But again, I just want to outline, this doesn't have to do with safety. It has to do with equity and how we look at the whole world, because at the end of the day, we're not safe until the whole world is safe. And you're going to hear more about this, about how people are using vaccines and how vaccines are wasted in some countries. So look at AstraZeneca. It gets wasted in our country. People in India, they need this vaccine so badly because they're dying of COVID. So it's about inequity, not safety. And Claire, can I answer the mandatory question that somebody posed that I dismissed right away and then I worry I'm going to forget about?
Absolutely.
So that's a great question. Somebody said, well, are they going to make vaccines mandatory for people, for teens to go to school in the fall? And the way mandatory vaccinations in Alberta, I do not think are going to happen in our school system. And I don't imagine that with a public education system, we're going to have mandatory vaccines. Where we do see that and might potentially see that is in some private schools, or definitely, and we're seeing that in universities. I don't think it's going to be at the level of the secondary student learning. I could be wrong and I could be surprised on this, but I don't think we're going to see mandatory vaccines. This issue of mandatory vaccines in our province has been going on for a long time. And I have a hard time seeing Alberta put in mandatory vaccination for kids to go to school.
Just about the universities, it probably won't be maybe necessarily for in-person class, but definitely for a lot of the residences. A lot of the residences are saying you have to be vaccinated to be living in that congregate setting.
All right, we have one question jumping back to pregnancy. If we don't have years of data and even in enough women, how, Dr. Sun and Dr. Cora, please feel free to jump in as well, how can we be sure it's safe? And
again, it's hard to provide an answer to say that it's completely safe, but we definitely know of the extreme risk of pregnancy. Many people who don't receive the vaccine say they will very much limit their exposure. But in pregnancy, it's hard for you to limit that exposure. You have to be in, going to do your test. You have to go to the hospital. You might have other complications. You're at very high risk for disease. And we know with certainty that COVID-19 produces so many complications for pregnancy, so that the benefits so far outweighs the risk. Okay, it's like anything in life, we have to assess risk. It's not risk or being risk-free. It's like if I send my kids to school, is it okay to take that risk of being bullied and being exposed to communicable diseases versus the risk of not having a good education if I was to teach them at home? So we're always assessing that risk level, and we would definitely recommend that pregnant women receive the vaccine, but certainly it's not to mandate anyone to receive the vaccine. Otherwise, you can't go into hospital, and there's no way we're going to do anything like that.
Thank you. Now, the kids that have had myocarditis or even pericarditis, where the second doses were given maybe at a shorter interval, like 21 or 28 days, is it a chance that spacing it out might minimize the risk? And if kids are having a good immune response, will they maybe only need one dose?
And that's a brilliant question. And I asked that question myself, and I know a lot of people are asking that question. And I think that's what we're going to see a bit more clarity on as they're looking at this. And I also suspect that probably we don't need our kids to have this vaccine exactly a month apart or 3 weeks apart because of their robust immune system. And they might actually be better off with a longer, wait a bit and then give them their longer second dose in terms of variant protection. But this is, I'm making this up right now. We don't have any evidence for that. The only evidence comes out of putting it kind of back to back at 3 to 4 weeks. So you understand how people have to do, you have to respect the if you can, respect the interval dose that has been set out in the clinical trials. But I suspect that probably waiting a bit or spacing this second dose might actually be okay for kids who have this robust immune response. But again, I'm kind of making, like, this is just my somewhat educated guess that I'm giving to you. But this is why there is this big meeting around this and say, well, can we think a bit about the spacing of this second dose for kids?
Right. No, absolutely. Thank you. Now, I have a question here about consent. So if a child at maybe the age of 14, 15 years old would like the vaccine, but the parents do not consent, does that child have the capacity to make the decision on their own or not?
I'm sure Dr. Sun probably has his own take on this, seeing how he actually, delivers vaccines. But as a pediatrician, we want to recognize that our children, especially older children, so we're talking about teenagers, are what we call mature minors if they understand the treatment, they understand the risks and the benefit of whatever treatment they're getting. In other words, they can make their own decisions, and they have a right to their decision and also to privacy of their or confidentiality of their information. We do this routinely with all kinds of medical treatments for children, for mature minors. So for teenagers, a mature minor is somebody who we deem understands the risk, the benefit, and the treatment itself. And it is the same for vaccination. And it's a tough one for parents to understand and to wrap their heads around, because they feel like they should be able to control what the decision around the child, but the kids have the teenagers it's their right to make this decision, and we as healthcare providers support that. But I also want to tell you that at no point do we ever encourage a teenager, unless we think it's unsafe for them, maybe that's the only time, we actually encourage them to share this with their parents, to talk to their parents about this, and we often offer to help them talk to their parents about it. So we always want the family involved and the family part of the decision process, but ultimately the mature minor is in charge of the decision and the confidentiality around it.
Yeah, and did you have anything to add, Dr. Sun, before I move to the next question?
No, that was a perfect answer.
Yeah, okay. So wondering when, we have a couple questions, wondering when the vaccination might be open to children under 12 years of age.
I get this asked on a routine basis by all my friends who have kids under 12 years of age. So the studies for kids under 12 are underway for both Pfizer and Moderna. And what they're looking at is not just safety and efficacy, but also what's the right dosage. Because 12 and older, especially if you're over 40 kilograms, we give you the same antibiotic dose or whatever treatment doses we give adults. But under 12, dosage is different. We have to choose the right dose for a younger, smaller child. So those are all underway. Moderna and Pfizer say that they're likely going to have results by the end of the summer, but there are a lot of things that will have to play into that. So one is, where are we at with the COVID numbers? Where are we at with variants? Is there a new variant? Are we seeing a fourth wave? And again, we have to shift vaccine to the most vulnerable people. People are going to look at the surveillance from having immunized 12 to 18-year-olds and the safety around that. So many factors will play into that decision. So I don't want to just say that, oh, well, it's going to be by the fall, because every parent I know is hoping that it's going to be by the fall. But I also want to say this is a complicated decision. It depends on many factors. And it's conceivable that 12 and under are not going to have, most likely not going to be vaccinated before the beginning of the school year.
All right. Now I have a question, and maybe this is one that you could answer, Dr. Sun, but wondering why people who have had COVID or even have had symptomatic COVID are not considered to be technically contributing to herd immunity, or why they might need the vaccine as well.
They should still be considered for a herd immunity, except it's hard to collect all this data, and a lot of this is overlapping data. So in a perfect world, if we could even, for example, do an antibody test for everyone, and it wouldn't matter if it was from the vaccines or from natural immunity. We can definitely, if that was an ideal world, okay, we would definitely count every source of immunity. But we know that with the vaccines, they actually produce a stronger response than natural immunity. So it's perfectly reasonable to boost our immunity so that we do not have breakthrough or recurrent infection. So the information on that also evolves. There are certain places around the world that recommend maybe just one dose of vaccine after you've been infected. So definitely that natural immunity counts.
Yeah, that's a perfect answer. And I struggle with this because, so first of all, people should understand that we do count it in herd immunity. So when people say 75% to 80% vaccinated, then they add 10 to 15%, assuming there's natural immunity to get to that 95%. It's difficult to measure natural immunity. Now we're learning more about it, that it does seem to last longer than initially people believed. And also, I think they're going to get new recommendations from NACI over the summer about how many doses of vaccine they need. Definitely at least one. If you've had COVID and then you get one dose of the vaccine, you're then the equivalent of somebody who's had 2 doses of the vaccine. So that's reassuring. Now, the question is, what does that second dose provide you? I think it provides you variant protection, probably better. But again, when should we give that? And what should the timing be? And more of this is going to come over the summer. I know it's being looked at. It's a very legitimate question and a concern. Many people are saying, well, you know, until now, nobody cared that I've had COVID in the past and I still have to isolate if I get exposed and so on. And it has to do with how difficult it is to track this.
Yeah. And just one last piece of data that, for example, the Delta variant, South African variants, they require 6 times as much antibodies to neutralize. So, you know, if you can get vaccinated and keep your antibody titers high, you're really giving yourself that protection.
Okay, and our next question is about kind of the vaccine specifically. It'll be one of our final questions. What is the shelf life of the vaccine? And also, just tacked on to that, how long does the spike protein or the materials of the vaccine last in our bodies?
The shelf life, so I keep vaccine in my own clinic. So, so once it's delivered to us and pharmacies, at regular fridge temperatures, we keep the Moderna vaccine for 30 days. And initially, it was only for 5 days for Pfizer, but then they adjusted for that. And they said that after 31 days, it was still okay to use. So we have many reminders to make sure we use up our vaccine supply within that period of time. So we wouldn't be providing anyone with expired vaccines. In terms of how long the protein would be in our body, I'm not actually sure. Cora, do you know?
There's a lot of stuff circulating on the internet about how it lasts, but actually it's a few hours to a couple of days. So this does not last for a long time in the body. If you wanted to find some very questionable sources of data about the spike protein lasting in the body for a long time, it's all conceivable, and people can go ahead and find that data. That's not real science, and it's a bit of fear mongering, but these are quickly out of the body, including the mRNA and the spike protein. The antibodies, however, do stay, which is the important part.
Okay, now I have the $1 million question, which I've gotten a lot over email and even a little bit in the Q&A, which is, if children don't seem to be very affected or don't seem to get very sick, then why should they be receiving the vaccine? And I know this is something that we went over in the presentation, but if you could kind of just, as one of our final take-home messages, answer this one as well.
Sure, I'll say it again. So the first reason for a child to get protected is their own personal protection. So this is not a benign disease in children. We've seen death in children. We're seeing significant inflammation. And we're now recognizing long COVID more and more in children, which is a very significant issue, to think that your previously healthy 10-year-old cannot do basic things like run around for soccer practice. So that's a big deal in terms of long COVID or post-COVID syndrome. So personal protection is first. Second of all, we'd love to think that kids don't transmit it, but now we know that they do. They have high viral loads. They can transmit even with mild symptoms. And there'll be people among us who are not going to be fully protected, and there will be situations where the children are the vectors. So there is a community protection component. And then, you know, I think ultimately the big reason is that kids want to go back to normal. And to go back to normal means that we have to have enough protection at the community level to be able to say that we can have all these things going on in terms of activities and businesses being open for children, for us all. And and I'm going to say one last thing, and that bit of herd immunity is going to be important when you think of variants, because we know that variants tend to occur and will occur whenever this virus mutates within many, many people. So when you transmit the virus and the transmission of the virus and the replication of the virus leads to these mutations and these variants. And I'm only going to say that my worst nightmare this whole year has been there would be a variant that all of a sudden would be more significantly severe or fatal to children. You know, every parent, before their own protection, you worry about your kids. And I worry about the shift in demographics. We're going to see it in the younger population. The sooner we get more people immunized around the world, the sooner we stop transmission and then replication of this thing.
Okay, well, I think we will start to wrap up there. I'm going to share the link to our survey once more. If you could give us feedback, we would so appreciate it. You'll just have to kind of scroll to the bottom of the first page and after reading it a little bit and then click to start. But we want to just first and foremost give a huge thank you to our special guests today and our experts, Dr. David Sun, Dr. Cora Constantinescu, and also Counselor George Chahal, all of our volunteers. We appreciate you all so much. So a big round of applause. Thank you very much. Again, I will be sharing the link to the survey in the chat one more time, if you wouldn't mind providing us with that feedback.
Thanks to everyone for listening. I haven't been able to answer too many questions. I'm just trying to squeeze in a few typed answers if possible. So, you know, if while we're still on here, I'll try to get to anything that I can share.
Yeah, and if you want to hang on for a minute, Dr. Sun, feel free to do so. And that goes for both of you. And also, if people have questions, I'll also put our email in the chat. Email us and we'll try to get you back to you in a timely manner if we didn't get to your question today.
Well, thank you very much for having us, and have a good night. I'm gonna check out here.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Cora. Thank you. Did you want to address the question about immunocompromised people?
Oh yeah, I was actually typing my answer for that one. But so this is a very common question I've received a lot, that if the vaccine might be more dangerous for immunocompromised people. But the fact is that you mount less of a reaction to the vaccine. So you're actually less likely to be affected, okay? So we know that the severely immunocompromised people don't have enough antibody response. And that's why a couple weeks back, they were recommended to receive the vaccine much earlier at the 4-week mark, rather than waiting until it was, you know, their previous allocated time. So the body does attack the protein made by the vaccine. That's true. Okay, you can say that. And we wanted to attack that protein to create immune memory, so that if we were to see that protein again in the natural setting during infection, the body will recognize it as soon as possible. But that reaction is actually much diminished if you're immunocompromised, okay, compared to if you're healthy. So, so it would be less actually of a concern of this reaction. Okay, that's not to say they won't have side effects. Okay, and we know again that with COVID-19, you're going to have much more immune implications, complications. So it's true that, you know, our conversation kind of revolves around what you type, the benefits outweigh the risk, but that is still very much the reality. Okay. Okay. Did you want me to try any other questions or?
Yeah, well, we have a question about weighing, like weight, the role weight might play in kids. Just how, you know, sometimes body weight is different in girls and in young boys. And if that plays any sort of role, or if they're ever weighed at a vaccination site, does that play a role to your knowledge?
Yeah, because currently there is no smaller dose. So there's been no data to say that weight, you know, would make it more dangerous if they were coming in, maybe perhaps a younger child who is going to be turning 12 this year and might be underweight. So it's going to be the same dose. Okay, they're not weighing these patients, but I mean that is a very much legitimate question. Okay, in the future, and as we move into the younger ages, weight is probably going to play a role.
Right.
Okay.
Do you want to, one of the other ones that I feel we can maybe address, and it goes back to what Cora was saying a little bit about just the timeline of, you know, the vaccines and how they were maybe developed, and, you know, have they been tested long enough, and any thoughts on that?
So I guess we like to use analogies. So if you have a gallstone, and right now in Alberta, it takes you maybe even a year to get in to see your doctor to arrange, you know, for the ultrasound, maybe CT, to see a specialist, arrange surgical time. And it takes a year, okay? And if I, you know, see that you're having a severe situation and we arrange it within a day to get that gallstone done, because something serious might happen, it's not that we really cut any steps. It's just that we've pooled all the resources in to get everything done as quickly as possible, okay? So that's the same analogy with the situation. It's that pooling of the resources, the coming together of all the professionals. So there wasn't any actual steps that were skipped. There are some areas where we're not entirely confident in terms of long-term data. Okay, that was forthcoming, but again, this is an emergency situation. Okay.
All right, so I'll leave it up to you to answer any others that you would like. Other than that, we will conclude our session.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.